All right, I'm going to go ahead and get started. Good morning, everybody. My name is Amy Sotomayor. I am the Deputy Director for the Enforcement Division here at TCEQ. This meeting is an informational meeting for a new order that we're about to roll out. We're looking for formal approval early next year. So I'm going to walk through the program and leave most of the time for questions. Towards the end, it's a very brief presentation, just giving the highlights of what we're intending to do, and then we'll leave time for questions. We do have folks online, and so for my folks online, you can drop questions in the chat, and we have some lovely folks helping me moderate those questions, and when we open it up for question and answer, they'll help me address any of the questions online. So with that, we will get started. I will introduce Gitanjali Yadav of the Litigation Division and Megan Hamilton, Acting Assistant Deputy Director for the Enforcement Division. Okay, so overall, the objective of this order with what we're trying to do is to achieve compliance faster with some of our regulated community, and then improve agency efficiency overall within the division itself. With this process for specific types of orders, we're going to be able to significantly reduce time and the staff resources necessary to move these orders through our process. The new process has reduced penalties, and I'm going to go through all these more in depth, but basically what we're looking at is reduced penalties, and then because we're achieving compliance a lot quicker, one of the big time savings and efficiency factors that we'll find is that on the back end, after an order becomes effective, the Enforcement Division staff will no longer have to track those orders for compliance because we will have already achieved compliance with these entities. And then again, the benefit for the regulated community is they're getting their orders a lot quicker, and they're also coming in compliance a lot quicker. So they're out of this process of enforcement a lot sooner than what we're seeing currently. So we do believe we have the legal authority to do this. It is an administrative order. It is not, it looks very similar when we start rolling these out. It will look very similar to what our current orders look like. They just, again, will move a lot quicker. They will include penalties. There won't be corrective actions except for in the cases where they might participate in the third-party step, but otherwise no corrective actions. And through our process, we will consider all the things that we're required to consider as it relates to penalties. We are not mandated to provide a penalty calculation worksheet, so these will not come with a PCW, like we call them, but we will still consider all the factors we are required to consider through penalty calculation. So these are the programs and the total number of violations that we'll be looking at. You can see we have 102 in drinking water, 76 in waste, 11 in water, and 4 in air. When we started looking at this program, or looking at this project, and I will tell you it's kind of been a labor of love of a lot of different people. We started this almost a little over 2 years ago and really looked at PST first. But then as we started to dig in, we were like, well, why can't we find some ways to make this work for some of the other programs? And we're really looking at those violations that have minimal to no impact on human health or the environment. So we're not talking about your wastewater discharges. We're not talking about your big emissions events. Those aren't going to be eligible for this type of order. So we'll get into what we look at with the eligible violations. So the first thing is when we get a notice of enforcement in the division, every violation that's on that notice has to be on the eligible list of violations. So if we get an emissions event notice of enforcement, but it has 3 violations that are on the list, 1 violation is an emissions event, it's not eligible for the program because emissions events are not eligible for the Expedited Compliance Order program. All of the violations must be, they must come into compliance within 60 days. They should be able to be corrected within 60 days. So as we were looking at what kinds of violations, we were looking at what violations we believed a respondent could get into compliance within 60 days. And those are the ones we've set up in this program. We may have situations where respondents are like I can't do it in 60 days. Okay, we're going to take you the normal path, right? Because that's part of this is continuing to move it quickly. And so if we can't get to that compliance piece in 60 days, we're going to take them through the normal process. We understand it might take longer, but that's part of this. To get this benefit, you got to be able to correct it quickly. And then they typically cannot include a suspected or confirmed release or spill or require that long-term remediation, right? Because that's going to have to take longer than 60 days in most cases, right? And in those cases, we're also talking about actual impact to human health potentially, or the environment. And then the last note is for the violations, it can't meet the findings criteria, and so that's laid out in statute. Then we start looking at the respondent considerations. And so respondents are not able, you're not eligible for this program if you have an active or pending matter at the AG's office. You cannot have any pending or active default shutdowns, no revocations, no outstanding fees or penalties, and you can't be a repeat violator or unsatisfactory performer. So when we do the compliance history classification, if you show up on those lists, you're not eligible for this program. And then the last one is you may not have been offered an expedited compliance order for the same violation at the same facility, same respondent. And that we put a 2-year time clock on that. Again, if you've had it in the last 2 years, you're not going to be eligible for it again, right? Other considerations, all of these orders will still go through Texas Register. That's a statutory requirement. We have to publish all orders in the Texas Register for 30 days for public comment. These are not going to be exempt for that. They will still have to go through Texas Register publication. And respondents will still be able to participate in the Supplemental Environmental Project program. So the third-party contribution SEPs, that will still be available to them if they so desire. Penalty considerations. So as we were looking at this, again, we were talking about, well, how do we move these quickly? And so at the end of, and I'll walk through the 3 considerations, but at the end of it all, what we're looking at is a 50% reduction in the base penalty. And so what that includes is that 20% deferral that we include in all agreed orders if they're coming through enforcement division, right? And they're not a findings order. So if they're a 1660 order, they get that 20% deferral. It includes 20% good faith effort, which again, we're getting compliance. So that would be a normal part of our process if we were taking this through the longer process, right? And we're giving them that 10% compliance history reduction, considering they might be a high performer, right? We are required to consider compliance history, and so we're doing that 10% reduction for a total of 50% penalty reduction. So this is an example of what it could look like for some of our orders that we've actually had move through our division. So in this one, you'll see the left side was the process of how it moved through the division. We actually did not get compliance on this one and ended up having to refer it to the litigation division. The total payable penalty was $1,140. So if we had had this available and we had offered it and they had accepted and had come into compliance, we would have gotten to compliance by October of 2024. And in this one, we actually did not get it to litigation until April of 2025. So we still didn't have compliance, right? So we got to compliance almost a year before we ever would have considered getting there in the normal process. And the penalty was reduced. This one was for failure to provide all ground storage tanks with a liquid level indicator. And you can see it's a minor facility, so not a major PWS facility. One more example, a PST, kind of same walkthrough. It was referred to litigation in November of 2021. Had we had this available to us and we had offered it, they accepted, we could have got it in compliance and through the system by August of 2021. So just a lot faster. And really the goal here is to get to that compliance piece a lot quicker. We want our entities to be able to get into compliance sooner, address the issues. And really, for the internal piece, what this allows us to do is really focus on those more egregious cases that really need us to dig in and figure out what's going on and make sure we're getting those TRs in place that get this situation or the issues addressed completely at those sites. This one was a failure to monitor and detect, or which will detect a release. So, all right, I told you it was a very brief PowerPoint. So I will turn this off and open it up for questions. We do have a list. We have not, it will be available so the next steps in this process, we'll get through the informational meetings this week, and then we will file for backup because it's considered an enforcement policy, we will require commission approval of it. So we will take it to commission either the second agenda in January or the first agenda in February is the goal. And so it will be filed with the backup when we go to agenda. Yes, I will do that. The question was, do we have a list of the violations? And I said it will be available once we file for backup for commission agenda. They get. Normally what happens, they only out. So the question is, are we giving the 10% no matter what, whether they're satisfactory or high? The answer is yes, that is the intent. And again, it's part of that incentivizing, trying to get them to get into compliance and agree to do this program. They don't get to do it repeating times, right? They've got to, if they come back to us within the 2-year period, we're going to send them through the normal process that will have higher penalties. But because it is something we have to consider, we're taking that off the standard penalty. And when we file, the violation list also has that penalty amount. And so you'll see kind of what that number looks like for each of the violations on the list. But it does include the 10% regardless of satisfactory or high. Yeah, falling. So the standard penalty, like the statutorily standard penalty, right? And then we, adjusting based on all the different, correct. So like for PWS, it's, $5,000 per day per violation, right? And so we're starting there and then bringing it down. And so each one, that's how we get to that number. Yeah.
But entities wouldn't receive like
Yeah, so the question was just clarification on whether or not entities would receive the PCW, and that's correct. They will not receive the PCW. We will not create a penalty calculation worksheet because the violation you'll see it, right, on our list of violations. And we'll work on a webpage where all this information will also be posted. But you'll know what that penalty amount is. It'll be out there for everybody to know what it is. And so there's no reason to have the penalty calculation worksheet. And that's part of why we can move this more quickly because we won't have that piece. The goal really is to get this out to respondents within 30 days, if not sooner, right? We're going to be making a phone call within that first 10 days to say, hey, you're eligible for this. Do you want it? If they say yes, we'll move forward. We'll tell them what you have to do to get it, which includes the compliance piece, and then we'll move forward. But the goal would be to have it in the respondent's hands within 30 days, if not sooner.
Amy, there is a question online. Is it possible to sign up for an email list to get notified when the list of eligible violations is available?
We don't have a specific gov delivery for it yet, but we can. And then we can blast it out through other gov deliveries to make sure people know about it. Okay, thank you. So the question was, would we split enforcement actions where maybe one was not eligible, but the others were? Our intention is not to split. Similar to how we are not combining as much anymore, that creates more work for everybody if I start splitting cases as well. And so that's why that first look in is every violation eligible? And if it's not, you're not eligible, right? So our intention is not to split cases. The question is, are emissions events included? They are not. So
You said earlier like that.
no emissions events are included. Mm-mm. I lost battery. So the question was related to the SEP process, the Supplemental Environmental Project process. So the third-party contribution SEPs, that's a pretty quick review, and it can be worked within this process and get everything done with that. And we're asking that question up front. So when you get that initial phone call and we're telling you you're eligible for this, we're also going to be saying, are you wanting to do a third-party SEP, a contribution SEP? Now, if we're talking about cities or other entities and they might want to do a compliance SEP, I think we would just have to talk to them about that, right, and see what they need. As you would expect, a lot of these penalties are much lower, right? And so I would suspect if a city or other governmental entity, they may just choose to pay the penalty rather than go the compliance SEP route, right? But that'll be a one-off conversation, case by case. But the third party, one of the reasons why we can still offer the third party SEPs is because it's a quick process, it's a quick review.
Amy, we have a question online. Does the ECO exclude any particular industry, or is it eligible to all industries?
It is eligible to all industries. It may benefit some industries more than others. I think we're anticipating this really helps out more small businesses, but it is eligible to everybody. Whether or not everybody will be able to avail themselves of it, time will tell. So the question was, how do we envision it working with the enforcement diversion program? Yeah, I mean, I think part of the way the enforcement diversion program works is when regional investigators or central office programs are sending cases up for enforcement, they are, for lack of a better word, checking a box. I think it actually is checking a box in our database that kind of sends it that direction first so that they can do an evaluation of whether it is appropriate or eligible for enforcement diversion. We aren't talking about this program until it actually enters our shop, right? And so if it is eligible, potentially eligible for EDP, it will go there first. And if they say yes, they'll take it. If they say no, then it'll be sent to us and we'll do our evaluation of whether ECO is appropriate or not.
Yeah. Is it going to be effective and look back once this becomes final, or is
So the question was, will we be looking backwards when this goes into effect? I think my answer will be, it probably depends, right? I think everything is case by case in enforcement. Yes, we're consistent with how we apply penalties and how we move forward with cases, but every case is unique. And so I think we would have to look at the circumstances of that entity and see what what the reality is. I can't promise we're not going to look back, especially if we have habitual issues at a site.
Amy, we have a few questions now. To be clear, this is not an option for actual events, even if minor, that don't have significant impact?
No, we do have some violations that are actual events. For example, outdoor burning is on the list, right? And so it will really, that one will really hinge on what the investigation found, right? What the impact of the outdoor burning actually had, right? If the investigation shows that it was a big impact, that there was a huge problem, that's not going to be eligible for the program. But if it was a less significant event, we would still consider it.
Can you please explain again the reasons that contamination and emissions events are not eligible for the program?
Because they are actual releases, actual discharges, and those have an impact on the environment and or public health, right? And so those shouldn't, we just believe those shouldn't be eligible for.
I do actually have another couple. Okay.
Oh, you have more?
Yeah. Will any existing open enforcement orders that haven't moved far along through the traditional process be moved over to the ECO process?
I think it'll be something we look at once we get approval for it. I will say that we are definitely pushing very hard to eliminate all of our backlog cases by the end of this fiscal year. That is our goal. At the highest levels of the agency, that is our goal. And so my hope is we don't have that scenario that we need to really take a big look, but we will. We'll look at it when we get, if and when we get approval for commission, it will be something we look at and evaluate.
And then will there be a recording of this presentation?
Yes. I got a thumbs up from the back of the room.
Within 60. Quicker. So like, are y'all?
So the question was, are we going to have resources for compliance assistance to verify that compliance piece? It'll be the enforcement coordinator's own division, but there will be an expectation that they're reviewing it quickly to make that determination, because the goal really is, a traditional order, even on kind of a happy path from start to finish closure, it can take over a year, or well over a year. And so this process from start to finish, we can be done within 6 months. So it's cutting our kind of happy path in half. Lots of times, even once we get to effective, the TRs can take us longer than that year, depending on the circumstances. But if they're pretty straightforward, like what these violations are, straightforward TRs, kind of that happy path would be about a year. And so we're looking at cutting that time in half. And that will be partially on us reviewing compliance documentation timely. We won't take it to agenda until we review that compliance documentation. So we won't take it until we know we have compliance, because if we don't get that compliance in 60 days, we're gonna move a different direction.
Right. So like y'all are incentivized.
They'll go through and I'll say they'll either be kicked into the standard process, or if they're just not responding to us, then they'll go visit my friends in litigation.
Get a quicker path to location.
Potentially, yes, if we just have unresponsiveness. But yeah, most situations I would expect it. Maybe they just didn't realize maybe they needed more time, and so then we would work with them through the standard process, right? But then they would lose the penalty reduction.
We'd have another question online. Related to respondent considerations at the OAG, would this include child support matters?
I'm looking at Gitanjali.
I guess I don't understand the relationship of
If it was an individual that we were enforcing upon.
relationship. We don't have those cases.
I don't think I know the answer to that right at this moment. I think we'd have to look into that from a legal angle, and we can certainly do that and follow up. We'll figure out a way to follow up on that question.
Would violations that require long lead equipment or controls as a corrective action be considered for ECO?
If they cannot be corrected in 60 days, they will not be considered for ECO. So if an equipment purchase that you're not going to be able to get in for 6 months to a year, you would not be considered for this. So the question was 60 days from the interview or 60 days from when we call. It's actually even different from that. It's 60 days from the day you get that document from us. So we're getting it out. So really you have 90 days pretty much from the date of the violation or the date of the interview, because we're going to try to call y'all within that 10 days. We're going to try to get it out to you guys in 30 days. So that's when your 60-day clock starts.
Backer questions from these information. Just
Yeah, so we're not accepting formal comments, but I always welcome feedback. So if you have feedback, you can shoot me an email or we can have a phone call conversation. Either way, I do anticipate we will provide general feedback to the commission on what we heard through these informational meetings, but we're not doing a formal kind of comment.
How about permitting requirements? Those are things that usually take longer than. Outside the scope of the. That you need to get a new authorization and an authorization.
So the question was permitting requirements. If it's a permitting requirement that we know takes longer than 60 days, it's not going to be eligible for this. There are some notifications, stormwater, MSGP type things that they technically can get in 60 days. Those could be considered, but not anything that we know there's no way you're going to get it in 60 days.
No questions right now.
Working on finding a place to put it online as well. I don't have a web page built for this yet, but we're working on it and we'll get one up. Forgot to look at that number before we came over. The question was how many? I think it's about 300. 30%. I'm sorry, 30%. Yeah. So it's not an overwhelming number, but it will help. Again, not only internally, right? Because we obviously have a backlog. Everybody knows we have a backlog. But it will help us stay current moving forward. And so as we've looked for ways to find some efficiencies, this seemed like a win-win for us and regulated community and the general community, because we're getting that compliance so much quicker, right? And so it's not dragging out that compliance piece, because, I mean, to be frank, we have respondents that wait till they get that effective order before they start working on compliance. And so this compels them to move quicker.
Excuse me. We have another question online. What is the target implementation date?
So it depends on which agenda we go to, but we do intend to implement pretty much immediately after agenda. We are getting everything set up to have that implementation almost instantly. Yeah. The question was, will they be able to offset, like, entities that can only do 50%, will they be able to offset the whole? No, they'll still only be able to offset 50%.
We have a question online. Have other states implemented similar processes?
I don't know the answer to that. I have not researched that. I think, I don't know. I don't know the answer to that. So the question is, how will it show up? Just like all the other orders. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it'll show up like a 1660 on their compliance history. It is still an administrative order. It is following all our guidelines there. It's nothing different. So it'll show up as a 1660. The violations will show up. They'll just show up as resolved, right?
We have a question online, and you kind of touched on this before, but it's kind of a nuance. If an eco settlement offer is made and the violator initially thinks that corrective action can be done in 60 days, what happens if the corrective action ends up taking longer by a month or so?
In general, what will happen is we will send them through the normal process, right? I don't want to speak in like just hard absolutes, but the point of this is to get that compliance in 60 days and move this order through the process quickly and efficiently. And so we will have a very frank conversation with those respondents about what is the issue, and then make that determination. But in general, the thought would be that they would move into the standard process.
Or would y'all take that out of your normal? Okay.
Yeah, so the question was, would they still get the 20% expedited deferral? So no, they would still get that, they would, unless it was the unresponsive piece, but in that scenario, it's not. They're just saying, hey, it's going to take us longer. They would still get that 20% deferral. They might get GFE if they got it across the finish line before we got to before we sent them out a revised order. And then the compliance history piece would just depend on what their actual classification was. So, but they would still get that 20% deferral.
Yeah, it just strikes me that for processing, to incentivize this, I guess just thinking about because at that point, you have to create a PCW and technical requirements, and it does. If you can get clients before and we're, I guess you're kind of eating into that time. Get there.
Yeah. The comment was that it might be a reason for them to not move quickly, potentially, if they can still get some of those points. Maybe. I mean, I'm hoping that's not a scenario we see very often. But we'll obviously be watching closely and evaluating success and fine-tuning internal processes if we find some that need to be fine-tuned as we move along. Any questions on that?
We were addressing a sidebar question, so sorry, 1 second. It does not appear so.
I think we've hit. I don't want to cut anybody off from asking any more questions, so certainly raise your hand if you have any. We, like I said, the intent is to go to commission agenda. Last agenda in January, first agenda in February. We're kind of working out those details now based on what else is on these agendas. But we will also work on setting up a specific gov delivery for this matter and kind of blast it out across all the others. And I really appreciate y'all coming out. If you have any follow-up questions, my information is on the slide. Happy to visit with anybody. And then if you just want to send thoughts and feedback, happy to take that as well. It will not be considered formal comments, but I do anticipate we will provide general feedback to commission when we go on what we heard through these information meetings. So thank y'all for being here.